Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Mukhtar Rabban, the coordinator of the Humanizing Pedagogy Praxis and Research Niche at Nelson Mandela University, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all to our fourth webinar in the Exploring a Humanizing Pedagogy series. Welcome back to the continuation of our webinar series, and best wishes to all for 2021. We are particularly honored and excited today to welcome a world-renowned scholar, Professor Anderson J. Franklin, from the United States. We also welcome Dr. Bruce Darmans and Dr. Deidre Geduld from Nelson Mandela University here in South Africa. Dr. Darmans is the project manager for the Hubs of Convergence and director for the Center for the Community School, and he will be providing welcoming remarks and officially introduce our speaker. Dr. Geduld is a head of department in the Faculty of Education and will also honor us with a response to Professor Franklin's presentation. I welcome everyone joining us on Zoom, all of our webinar participants and those watching the stream on Facebook. Feel free to engage with us on the platform. On behalf of the HP Project, the Learning and Teaching CoLab, and the Faculty of Education, a hearty welcome. There are a few house rules that we need to follow. In the Zoom room, the mics have been muted for the duration of the presentation and response. Please feel free to post questions and comments in the chat while the presenter and respondent are speaking. Facebook viewers may post comments and questions on the live stream as well. There will be a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar, and all questions will be posed then. At that stage, you may also raise your hand or request the mic in the chat, and I'll send you a request to unmute. You may also send your questions directly to me by selecting my name from the drop-down menu. We are looking forward to an engaging session this afternoon. On that note, we welcome Dr. Bruce Darmans.
Thank you so much, Mukta. A very good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to the third engagement of the Exploring Humanizing Pedagogy series, hosted by the Humanizing Pedagogy Praxis and Research Niche at Nelson Mandela University. My name is Bruce Darmans, and I'm the project manager of the Hubs of Convergence in the Engagement and Transformation portfolio at Nelson Mandela University. And I have the singular pleasure of introducing Professor Anderson J. Franklin, but more affectionately known to us as AJ. AJ, as Mukta has mentioned, is an illustrious scholar with a long career in academia, as well as being a staunch civil rights activist. AJ is the Honorable David S. Nelson Professor Emeritus at Boston Lynch School of Education and Human Development. He's also Professor Emeritus of Clinical and Social Personality Psychology at the City College and Graduate School of the City University of New York. He is an honorary professor within the Center of the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, CANRAD, at Nelson Mandela University. And he also he collaborates closely with the Faculty of Education, and in particular, the Center of the Community School. Now, beyond these illustrious titles, AJ is a devout husband, a father, grandfather, mentor, and counselor to many of us across the globe, especially us emerging academics, and he sometimes got some of us in some serious trouble in positioning us at our various institutions. But we are truly blessed to have you in our space, AJ. And we really look forward to your presentation today around a title, Cultural Brokers as Translational Agents in the Coalition to Achieve a Humanizing Pedagogy. With that, thank you very much, Mukta, and over to you, AJ.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the illustrious welcome from my dear friend, Dr. Bruce Darmans. Thank you, Mukhtar Rabban, for being very gracious in indulging me across the waters with our communications and helping me getting prepared for this particular time. And I don't want to take too much time up, but as many people know, that Port Elizabeth is like a second home to me, since I've been back and forth there so many times and am a honorary professor at NMU. I want to spend a little time talking about my topic here, and I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully the technology will work. So everybody can see that, hopefully?
Yes, Prof.
Okay. So I want to talk about a topic called cultural brokers as translational agents in the coalition to achieve humanizing pedagogy. And I've given some thought about how best to represent a really complex topic within a very complex area, which we are calling humanizing pedagogy. And let me start by saying that when we think of humanizing pedagogy within the framework of informing learning and teaching, I think of it as a major enterprise to advance humanizing pedagogy. My good friend and colleague, who was faculty of education at NMU and then became the Deputy Vice Chancellor, has embraced this particular philosophy and concept for some time and has even educated me about this and has helped to underscore the importance of it. So Denise Zinn defines human pedagogy, and let me say that I had the good fortune of having her and Al Witten attend the Boston College Roundtable. And I'm actually taking some of this from her presentation back in 2013, I believe, where she gave a university-wide colloquium. And she talked about, in her presentation, humanizing pedagogy. And her definition is teaching and learning that seeks to build the humanity and full potential of the whole human being, and the belief that everyone through their humanness brings a gift to the world, each in her or his own way. That is a rather great mandate for us to fully grasp and understand when we are talking about something as aspirational as humanizing pedagogy, because we're talking about implicit as well as explicit in this definition, the whole child, and developing the whole child into what I call the whole adult, and therefore understanding what transpires between what I call the cradle to the career. And then I add on to it 24/7, meaning that we have an understanding of what contributes to the development of the child every minute of the day, 24 hours of the day, 7 days out of the week. And so if we are going to be successful to fully develop the child into this person, then we have to be very much mindful of every step and every point along the developmental chain, the developmental steps, the developmental stages. And what is it that we contribute to that particular process? So I want to focus really upon three questions, which is, what is the enterprise of humanizing pedagogy? What is the role of cultural brokers in humanizing pedagogy? And what is the importance of coalitions in implementing humanizing pedagogy? So I want to spend a little time with each one of these questions and see if we can expand our understanding of what the challenges are for learning and teaching if we are going to undertake this enterprise of humanizing pedagogy? Well, understanding the development of the whole child and going from cradle to career is the learning experiences of everyday life that shape the child into adulthood. And there are many contexts over the 24-hour period. There's the home context, there's the school context, and then I call the street life context, or really it's understanding what happens to the child after they are outside of our family nests, so to speak. And when they are with their peers, they're interacting with others outside of the family enclave. And what is it that we know and understand of the experiences that they are having once they are out of our sight, all right? And that all of those experiences are equally as important to understand because they also shape the child. And when I say from cradle to career, I'm mindful of, when we say cradle, I've had some people say, well, what's so important about the cradle? Well, many of us know that there's tremendous amount of research going on in the study of infancy development, attachment theory, understanding the bond between mother and child, not just in terms of the nursing of the child, but also understanding some of the ways in which the mother and infant relationship contributes to attachment and social and emotional development. And the assumption is that there's something foundational about that experience that we should be mindful of, because it is also a learning and teaching process. I was involved with the community project, and one of the major programs that were in partnership with us was called First Mothers, or First Teachers rather, in which there was a recognition that mothers played, and fathers too, a very important role early on in the life of the child, and truly, in fact, are first teachers. I remember when my first child was born, and that my, my mother and my parents and all extended family were very happy for this, one of the first grandchilds, and they would come to the house and they would look at the uh, infant in the cradle, and then they would start making all kinds of sounds that didn't make any sense. They're going, oh, Google, look at the little baby. Oh, look at her feet, and Google, blah, blah, blah. And they were speaking anything other than English for us. And so I would admonish my mother, said, Mom, look, talk regular to her. Don't just talk that babble. And my mother would look at me as if I was crazy, because she was showering love and affection upon her. And why was I, sort of chastising her about how to interact with her granddaughter? And so I explained to her that the interaction that I was, of course, a master's psychology student, and I had been immersed in studies of developmental psychology and language development. And so I said, what you say to her matters in terms of her acquisition of language. My mother just looked at me and said, okay, I've been doing this longer than you have. And so she went back to babbling with her. But the point being is that our interaction with children, even at the point of the cradle, is very important to how they are beginning to shape into the person that we want them to become. So I'm just saying that to make us mindful of the fact that there are many points along this process of learning and development and learning and teaching that are extremely important. And I believe that the concept of humanizing pedagogy makes us mindful of all of those different steps and all of those different stages. So one of the important elements of humanizing pedagogy is being aware of the diverse settings that contribute to our learning and development, and bringing that child throughout the entire process. as well as being mindful of that child's potential. So we need to be aware of such diverse settings as the township primary schools, the Model C schools, all the way through the university. In fact, each one of those school contexts presents particular challenges for learning and teaching that makes us be aware of the humanizing process is in place in each one of those settings, and to be aware of what is it that the child or student has been taught in the experiences of the township primary schools that prepares them not only in terms of reading, writing, and math, but also in terms of life, as well as being prepared for the classroom and being prepared for those things outside of the classroom. So when I think of humanizing pedagogy, I also think of the scope of this particular concept. And that's what I'm addressing when I am raising this question about the enterprise of humanizing pedagogy. It's the scope of the concept itself. And inclusive within that scope is also the concept that humanizing pedagogy is informed by both in school and out of school socio-emotional experiences. So we know this, explicitly in many respects, but I want to elevate it for us to be aware of the fact that social and emotional experiences, and of course, this is the psychologist in me talking, is extremely important in our understanding the learning and teaching process, particularly if we are trying to nurture this child into each stage fully. Each stage we are trying to achieve the fullest potential of the person in each stage of the process, that it is also informed by what is it that the child is experiencing in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom. And the home becomes an example of a socio-emotional context. So what goes on in the home is very essential to understand as to the behavior of the child in the classroom or in any other settings. So therefore, this particular enterprise becomes very complex and multifaceted, and it places tremendous amount of demand upon those of us who, as teachers or psychologists or even healthcare providers, are all participating in trying to maximize the learning experience so that the child can realize his or her full potential at each step or phase of the process. So this is the complexity of this particular enterprise, which is that we are maximizing the experiences for the person at each stage and phase of the process. That requires us to be competent enough, sophisticated enough, open enough, engage in sufficient critical thinking about this enterprise to realize that we have to bring the resources for each stage and each phase of the person's development if we want to have this outcome of having a contributing member as an adult to society. Now, we cannot do this alone, and I identify as a critical person or element in this process of humanizing pedagogy, the role of cultural brokers. What is the role of cultural brokers in humanizing pedagogy? So when I talk about cultural brokers, I'm talking about really a process, number one, which is that a cultural broker, in terms of their skill set and in terms of their role, is they are essentially helping us to build the bridges of communication for learning and teaching. I see them as translational agents that facilitate communication. Now, I want to be clear. they are something more than interpreters, language interpreters, you know, like they have at the UN or whatever. We're talking about someone that has much more comprehensive skills and plays a much more comprehensive role in this enterprise of humanizing pedagogy. They are really an essential part of the team because they help us to achieve the clarity and understanding of not only language, because that certainly is or can be a part of the necessary skill set, but the cultural broker also helps us to understand some things about the context that our students or the child is living in and is experiencing from day to day, and help us to understand something about the behaviors that may be a manifestation of that. Help us to understand something about why the child has a particular worldview or a particular perspective or a particular attitude about us as teachers or another child that they interact with. Where did, you know, where did they get this particular set of views or opinions? When you see children interact with one another, maybe a child is a bully. And we want to know, how did the child get to be so aggressive in their behavior? Maybe it is something about what they are experiencing at home or in the community. But if we're not in that home or in the community, we are really just speculating. But if, on the other hand, we have persons who are familiar with the home setting and the community and the environment, who could say, well, yes, AJ, you are right, that the aggressive behavior that you're seeing in these children are in fact a product of their home environment and or the community in which they are growing up in. And therefore, this is why you are seeing the attitude in the classroom, you are seeing the behaviors towards other children in the classroom. These are the things that help us to understand, well, now, what is our challenge? If we want to maximize the learning and teaching, we are going to have to understand the behavior of the child within this context. So cultural brokers are more than just language interpreters. They are really translational agents, as I like to call them, because they do facilitate this broad area of communication. They do help to interpret and better represent the perspectives of others. They can be, for example, instrumental in helping us to understand what's going on in perhaps family dynamics. So let me give you an example of that. Very often, one of the things that I, instruct my students when they are trying to communicate with the parent about child's behavior or some particular goals regarding school and achievement, and they are not being very successful in, let's say, negotiating homework and home study time. So one of the challenges in some of our programs, and sometimes working with underperforming youth or even youth in general, and families that are struggling with poverty and with a host of other life stressors, that a child that's in school has responsibilities given to it by the school, such as homework, and that may not be fully understood or appreciated by the family. And we may have, in, let's say, parent-teacher consultations, we're sitting and we're talking to the parent, and we are laying out that it's important to have homework time or study time at home, and that the child is not being successful in their in-class performance because they're not able to study and do further work or homework when they are out of school and they are at home. And so we may want to understand somewhat about, well, what is the balance between home chores and study time? And we may have, difficulty in understanding why is it in many parent consultations that the behavior and performance of the child has not changed. And part of that may be that two things. There is not an appreciation or understanding of the necessity of study, because there is the necessity of home chores and being a part of the family in executing those chores. And on the other hand, there may not be a full understanding of the importance of homework and doing the studies at home and continued preparation. So how do we achieve this balance between what is, let's say, teacher objectives and parent objectives? Right? Teacher objectives being to maximize the ability of the child to be able, and the student to be able to study, and say the objectives of the parent to make sure that all members of the family fulfill their family responsibilities and home responsibilities. So how do you negotiate that balance? Well, a cultural broker could be informative in helping us to understand that maybe we're talking to the wrong person, that maybe the person that you should talk to is, in addition to the mother, maybe the grandmother. And we may ask, well, why is that the case? And be somebody who is perhaps more familiar with the family may be able to tell us that the grandmother actually is the major power broker and decision maker in the family, and that the mother really doesn't, or the parent really doesn't fully execute any decision without running it by the grandmother and getting the grandmother's input and approval. And the cultural broker, who could be, for example, if we had some connections to, let's say, the pastor in the community who could help us understand something about the families in his congregation, could tell us, oh, well, let me share something about the families in my congregation, and our student may be, and his family or her family may be a member of the congregation. And so the pastor in this regard, and in my example, could be a cultural broker in helping us to understand the family dynamics there, but also the dynamics within the community as a whole. So that's an example of how a person, or even in this regard, the church and community, could serve in the role as cultural brokers, helping us to understand behavior, context, and values, helping us to interpret and better represent the perspectives of others. So my position and argument here is that as we go through this enterprise, this really large enterprise of developing humanizing pedagogy for our teaching and learning, we are mindful of ways in which other resource persons can contribute to the development of our intervention plan. And there is something about the skill set of cultural brokers that should be essential in our training to fully understand ways in which we can maximize communications. So my suggestion is that we use cultural brokers as part of our toolkit, one of our tools in our toolkit of skills for our practices of learning and teaching. So adding the cultural broker in this skill set of cultural brokering is important in our objective for humanizing pedagogy, but it's also important in the larger intervention scheme I see that is necessary for achieving the kind of outcomes we want to have in humanizing pedagogy for learning and teaching. So what is the importance of coalitions in implementing humanizing pedagogy? As Bruce, Damon, and Denise and all are well aware of, I'm a big advocate for developing collaborations and coalitions, and developing partnerships with other people and organizations to do those things that I don't have the skill set or the resources to do, but are necessary to achieve this overall objective that I have. And if our overall objective is to bring a child from cradle to career, from an infancy and young child to an adult that realizes their full potential, then there are a lot of things that have to be a part of the learning and teaching scheme throughout each stage of development that I know I don't have sufficient skills or competencies to achieve. And so I have to collaborate with others if I truly want to achieve this aspirational goal of humanizing pedagogy. So it requires strategic planning, critical thinking. I think of Pablo Freire's critical consciousness and critical thinking. I mean, implicit and explicit in his thinking was a whole model of bringing persons along, bringing populations along, bringing people, students along to think differently as a important skill set in order to have fulfillment as an adult and as a person. And that's what we want to do. When we say we want to participate in learning and teaching so the person becomes fulfilled, that their potential is fulfilled throughout their life, then we have to make sure that we are having the input throughout the person's life that makes them successful in achieving this goal that we are so intent on striving for. So learning and teaching to incorporate humanizing pedagogy does require strategic planning, critical thinking about the education model that we are using, critical thinking and strategic planning around the education plan, strategic thinking and critical strategic planning and critical thinking about the educational team. So one goal here is to have a collective impact on the objective of bringing the person to fully realize his or her potential. It's a team effort. If we step back and think about it, it always has been a team effort, meaning that if we were to look at both the in-school and the out-of-school experiences, what the family brings to this particular effort, what the teachers bring, what the peer group brings to this particular effort of achieving the full potential of the person, all of these segments of life, all of these learning experiences, either formally or informally, meaning, you know, we either structure them and be very deliberate and conscious about those experiences, or they just happen informally. They all end up contributing towards developing that person into adult. Now, if we want to play a role in that process so that we are contributing towards positive outcomes, then we have to do it by a team effort. This aspiration is won by a team effort. And I think that if we step back and look at what is being proposed at Nelson Mandela University, in my years and experience there, we have what the Vice Chancellor, Sabongile Mutwa, Professor Mutwa, has proposed of bringing the resources of the university, the different faculties, organizing them in a way to be able to extend them in a beneficial way to the community at large, and figuring out, well, how do we do that? You know, it is implicit way of humanizing pedagogy or humanizing the resources within our university system so that we now are a part of the community and a part of the whole society effort to maximize the potential of our citizens, of our adults, of our youth, of our children, in terms of envisioning the larger perspective. So hubs of convergence, has a major task to achieve mobilizing the resources of the university in a way that it can act as a team to have an impact upon some of the challenges that we see in the community, in the Eastern Cape, in PE. It is an undertaking that I advocate can't be done without having cultural brokers, or at least the skills of the cultural brokers, those people and those processes, those skill sets that maximize the interpretation and translation between diverse parties, so that we can have the kind of positive outcomes that we want to have. In 2018, in July 2018, the Faculty of Education and the Center for Community Schools, we had a roundtable colloquium that was somewhat modeled off of the roundtables that I had at Boston College that Denise Zinn attended. And so during that 2-day period at Nelson Mandela University, we were able to bring together people from the formal sector, the informal sector, and the non-formal sector, over 200 participants from across these different sectors. This diverse group came together to talk about how can we together have an impact on the wider community, the Eastern Cape, in ways in which hadn't been done before. And so at the end of those 2 days, the group itself nominated members to a coalition, a committee, a group, which became the Lasema Nelson Mandela Bay, which still is meeting and deliberating today. And I'm happy to be an international honorary member of the Lasema Nelson Mandela Bay group. And we're still deliberating about ways in which across sectors, the formal, the non-formal, and the informal sectors, to mobilize our resources, our understanding, our capacity to be able to impact our individual organizations, utilize the resources from our individual organizations, understand what each brings to the table, so to speak, and think through ways in which we can work together towards this objective, which is implicitly and implicitly helping to maximize learning and teaching in a fashion that humanizes pedagogy. So I will end at this point to say that this cultural brokers is something that has been utilized in a variety of different ways by a variety of different disciplines. It's not only in education, we use it in psychology. The whole concept of paraprofessionals in the classroom is really an extension of cultural brokering, meaning that there is some belief that paraprofessionals, whether it's in the school system, in health, or in other sectors, can contribute to our being more effective. In business, we have cultural brokers, but we just don't call them cultural brokers. So for business to be able to sell their skin products, they have cultural brokers involved. They just happen to call them marketers and pay them a whole lot of money to figure out what it is that they can learn about us as persons to be more effective in selling their products to us. So we want to sell and be more effective in selling humanizing pedagogy to the learning and teaching enterprise. So at that point, I will end and certainly am open for any questions and response from Professor Geduld. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Before we take questions and the comments that have been coming forth, I'm going to ask Dr. Geduld to deliver her response, and then we can explore the questions and comments.
Thank you, Mukta. Good evening, Professor Franklin and colleagues. I'm very excited to participate in today's session and to be a respondent to Professor's presentation. Allow me, Prof, to say thank you for your thought-provoking presentation and also for sending me your presentation to assist me in the process. When I received it, Prof, I must be very honest that some words really intimidated me. For example, cultural brokers, enterprise, market strategies, and so forth, which resulted in me then having to call a family meeting with my son and daughter. I'm putting off my video, colleagues, because it seems quite dark in the space and I don't know why. Yes, and in calling the meeting, I wanted them to assist me with these concepts because as a foundation phase primary school teacher, these words were very intimidating to me, Prof. Then I decided, after having a bit of clarity, it was like a kind of a eureka moment for me. I have this. But then I thought of the site coordinators that work with us in our primary schools and high schools in the metro. These site coordinators are mothers, fathers, grandparents, etc. They also run reading clubs at schools, maths clubs. They also assist with homework, etc. So I thought this group will really be able to assist me as I try to make meaning of the presentation you sent to me, Prof. And I did not consult with everybody, but I had a discussion with our action learning set, as well as our care set. Now the care set is a small group of 3 ladies who assisted me. And they were like, Didi, what is happening here? What are these words? Are we supposed to understand it? So I said, okay, let's just go through it and let's make meaning of it. And the question to me was, so have you spoken to Papa Freire about this? And I was like, really? I have 1 day left and you want me to go and speak to Papa Freire? In any case, so I journeyed into some of Freire's writing and I asked myself, so what is it that makes Freire's education program so appealing to people? And my reading brought me to the following conclusion, Prof, that it is an eclectic blend of Marxism, Christian humanism, and existentialism, which appeals to people. And it teaches us all good things evolve from the power of the individual. And I'm so glad to see that in your presentation, you speak about from cradle to career. And for me, it's important as the HOD of the Foundation Phase program that this aspect of from cradle is so emphasized and the importance of starting there to lay a good foundation in terms of the education of our children. But what struck me even more when you presented your presentation was the image of the child. So what is the image of the child that we hold within our foundation phase program, in our IP, in our SPFET, and in our whole schooling system or schooling context within South Africa? My reading brought me to the following piece that says, there's nothing in Freire's pedagogical model that offends people. It is child-centered, based on dialogical learning, the curriculum is, and now I'm talking about child because of my focus in the ECD, early childhood development. It is focused it derives from the participation of the participants. There are no teachers. And I heard you say there are facilitators, Prof, which is so important. There are no teachers, we are all in the same space and we are collaboratively learning as best we can. So adult people felt at home with Freire's pedagogy, which seems to reflect the best principles. Now, having said this, one of Paulo Freire's principal concerns in the last years of his life was the destructive impact of neoliberal ideas. And I was struggling with the terminology, but in your presentation, I'm asking myself, I can feel the humanizing pedagogy which springs from it, but why are we using these neoliberal terms? Especially when children are one of the most important beneficiaries of a thing called a humanizing pedagogy. So, in the last 5 decades following Paulo Freire's death, neoliberalism has continued to evolve with its influence extending to a wide range of countries across the globe. Of special significance for education are the ontology of self-interested individualisms that underpin neoliberal thought. This reliance on the model of the market, Prof, as guide when structuring educational systems, the treatment of knowledge as a commodity and the logic of performativity that drives institutional life. This is my concern. And so I ask myself, so how do we contextualize Prof's presentation within the South African context? Because as a teacher, teaching on the Mission Vale campus, working with communities around me, how do I contextualize it? And more importantly, has Paulo Freire ever been to South Africa? Or maybe I must ask, has he been to Africa? And the answer is yes. During his lifetime, he visited Zambia, Tanzania, and many others like Angola and Cape Verde. He met with the People's Movement for Liberation of Angola and the Mozambican Liberation Front. Now, I am so happy to see my honorable teacher in the room, historian Allensen, that can maybe help us to explain further. So, Freire was also deep critical, Prof, of the capital system which exploits and dominates the bodies and the minds of the oppressed. And it is a major force generating the material and the ideological conditions that shape the domination of our consciousness. And as you were speaking about how do we conscientize using a critical approach, I'm mindful of how he utilizes this in his work. And a book that came to my attention is his Pedagogy of the Oppressed that he wrote during exile in Chile. And he says that it is in this time that there was a revolt in France. And it was at this time that he became conscious of France's Fanon's work on the wreck of the earth. And he says, whilst he was working on his pedagogy of the oppressed, he had to change it because of the writings of Frantz Fanon. He was deeply influenced by Fanon's radical humanism. So although the apartheid state, Prof, banned the pedagogy of the oppressed, we still had underground copies. And some of my colleagues in the room might have been distributors of these copies as well. I don't know. But in 1970, at the University of Christian Movement, Paulo Freire began to run inspirational literacy projects. And he worked clearly with South African Students Organization, was founded by Steve Biko, along with other figures in the South African movement. Now, why am I mentioning this? That people made, they used different community-based research as part of the process of conscientization. And this is what we tried to establish within the Foundation Phase program, Prof. How do we use groups of people in our community, no matter who they are, no matter what they are, and be cultural, or maybe I should call them, because this is what they want to be called, intercultural communicators. They say it's important that their knowledge be known to whoever comes and engages with the community. That the school is well aware, the teachers are well aware of what it is that underpins and what values their culture hold to them. So it's not just about being language translators, but it's holding this whole concept of their culture, of their knowledge, and disseminating those knowledges so that schools might know and also know what the principles are that by which they teach their children in communities. And so in conclusion, Prof, I want to say that it is important that we have clarity and that we have language which offers profound benefits. And as oppressed people, whether we are cultural workers, whether we are educators, whether we are parents, grandparents, that we do not need to sustain the disenfranchised or franchise or ignore it. We need to support rather than resist it. So your presentation fits well within the planning or the proposal that we have in mind with CCS in terms of how do we see the child progress in his or her community from the cradle up until they enter university and beyond. So it was quite a pleasure for me to form part of this discussion and to respond on it. And I thought that maybe Frey would be able to assist us as we try to familiarize ourselves with the terminology, with the concepts, with the ideas, and so forth as we move being and trying to be fully human. So thank you very much, Prof, and thank you, Mukta, for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Geduld, a head of department in the Faculty of Education at Allensen University. Thank you so much to Prof and to Dr. Geduld for the presentations. Prof, we have 6 questions, and I am mindful of the time. We have about 20 minutes left for the session. So I'm going to group some of the questions for you. The first 2 are possibly linked. They are contextually sort of linked. The first question, a comment in question, comes from Margie Childs. The concept of a cultural broker is an important one. Grandmother as an influential broker helped to add nuance to the concept. Thank you. Turning to a higher education context, could you share insights about potential cultural brokers? So that question relates to the higher education context. Then the second question that sort of branches off that one. Thank you for the presentation, Prof. Do you have some examples of methods one could use to incorporate and make these concepts practical into the average household? So the household context in the second question.
The first thing that comes to mind in terms, I'll answer the last one first, in terms of the household context. The first thing that comes to my mind is how in immigrant communities, often adolescents and children, when they move to a new country, are able to acquire the second language in a new country quicker than parents and elders of the families. And then they become the cultural brokers. Often they are seen as the language translators for the parent and the elders of the family that have not acquired the second language of their country as expert. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind, where there are within families and within communities, if you're looking for ways in which to identify cultural brokers within the community, within the families as such, you know, be mindful of who perhaps can serve in that capacity within the family and with the community to relate, for example, to the community, and who has been very successful at that in some way or another. And it does require some assessment of the roles that family members and community members have played in sort of negotiating or navigating the system. There usually are people within the family and within the community that show skills of cultural brokers because they have been successful in navigating the system, so to speak. They've been successful in dealing with other agencies that members of the family or the communities have not been as successful. And so that's a way of at least beginning to identify a person who has, from within the family or within the community, a skill set of cultural brokering. And that's also related to the university, where, and I'm glad that question was raised, there are faculty members or members within the university that have these skills too. They just are not necessarily on display because we never ask them to display these skills. But I know when I go home, well, I'm just thinking about when I would go home, we would engage in, I guess what linguists call and social scientists term code switching. I don't know if people are familiar with that. And so when I was, when I'm at the university, I have my university professorial language. But when I go home and I'm with the family, I have family language. And so I'm able to switch in from one setting to the other setting. And what I'm saying is that if you put in place some mechanism of assessing who within the academic community, your colleagues, has this ability to translate for us, to serve in this capacity of cultural broker, you'd be surprised, because many of us do that anyway. We're not professors at home, and our parents do not necessarily allow us to be Professor A.J. Franklin. My mother, my grandmother, and certainly all my aunts and uncles and members of the church, I was little A.J. I wasn't Professor Franklin. I was little A.J. And I had to learn how to switch out of the Professor A.J. Franklin role and become the son and the person that they knew me from the neighborhood and from the community. So there are university faculty and staff and people who have this code switching and this capability. We just have to look for them and identify them and give them permission, you understand, within the context of our plan, give them permission to serve in that capacity. There's a whole way of studying and understanding how you do that. But that's a great question. I really appreciate that question, because it is a matter of how do you identify cultural brokers, from multiple settings, the university being one, but also the community the other. That in fact was one of my early jobs, which was to work with adolescents in the community and find out, how to understand their life. And it was, I was what they call participant observer. So I lived in the community for over a year, working with delinquent and non-delinquent youth.
Thanks, Prof. I'm going to invite Professor Mzanga. She'd like to comment and pose a question, I think. Professor Mzanga.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof, for this presentation. I'm really happy that you mentioned the grandmother, who in my language is umakhulu, as one of the cultural brokers. Because what I've observed is that the main challenge in our curriculum is when we separate the student from their cultural knowledge and language experiences. And one of our colleagues, I'm not sure if she's here, Dr. Babalwa Makukwana, talks of repositioning umakhulu as an institution of knowledge, a role that was eroded by colonialization, religion, and so forth. And what I'd like to find out from you is, how do we then incorporate the role of the cultural brokers, but in this particular case, umakhulu, which is grandmother in English, in a curriculum that we claim is underpinned by the humanizing pedagogy? Because what is currently happening is, when we look at the grandmother, umakhulu, we look at a person who's just a teller of folktales, and we don't go beyond and look at this person as somebody who can disseminate, who can transfer and store knowledge and values. So what I'm asking is, how can humanizing pedagogy help us to reclaim their position, in the curriculum? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It's certainly, if humanizing pedagogy has as a critical component of understanding, the wealth of knowledge that exists within the family system, such as with grandmother, as well as within the community. You have to understand that in the community, they also have, if I can frame it this way, their indigenous humanizing pedagogy that's going on. We just are sometimes, I guess, too sophisticated to not recognize the humanizing pedagogy that is actually taking place in the families and in the communities. And so we're missing what grandmothers have in the way of knowledge and wealth of history that can inform us about our students and the children we're working with. If we would just develop the necessary mechanisms and procedures to tap into that wealth of knowledge, that will begin to transform and restructure what we do in the university in terms of the development of our curriculum. But we have to give ourselves permission. And I would say, by giving permission, we have to make it academically credible and valid to be able to go into the community, to tap into that wealth of knowledge, codify it, and bring it back into and integrate it into our curriculum. There's a great book, for example, about recently by my colleague Michelle Fine, called Just Research. And I'd worked with her, but this is really her effort to expand what is called participatory action research, or PAR. And in that book, she specifically talks about how her team and what she has promoted as a research methodology utilizes the knowledge of the people she is working with and want to study. So if you want to know about how to incorporate grandmother's wealth of knowledge, then set up a focus group for grandmothers and start talking to them and start tapping into that wealth of knowledge and understand the role that they play in the family system and how they contribute to the larger community. So that's a great question. And there are a lot of techniques in which, you can utilize if we legitimize in the university, incorporating the knowledge and the wealth of information and knowledge that exists in our families, in the communities.
Thank you, Prof. In our 9 minutes remaining, we have 4 questions to get to. The following 3 are linked. They're from Neil Honeycomb. Prof, what are your thoughts on the use of, for example, Yuri Bronfenbrenner's bioecological framework as a framework for approaching the holistic development of a child or learner throughout their lifespan, in considering universities as institutions which either directly or indirectly affect multiple systems of this framework? The second question, in what ways do you think universities might be able to positively contribute to an enterprise of humanizing pedagogy of individuals in light of this framework that considers systems which emphasize intra-system and inter-system relationships, for example, through coalitions? And then the last question, would this approach potentially pose an avenue for strategic thinking and transformation at a higher education level?
Just yes, to answer the last question. I think it definitely will contribute to that. The biggest obstacle to inter-system, inter-organizational, interdisciplinary work is the discipline's intransigence to accept new knowledge and new ways of doing things. That's the biggest obstacle for forming intergovernmental, inter-organizational relationships, is that we are pretty much captured, we're held hostage by our own beliefs, our own attitudes, our own views that are constructed by our disciplines, our subjects. We hold them to be, very valued, and it's a privilege to have that particular set of knowledge. So we want to be what the institution says that we should be, right? And we're going to be more professor than any professor happens to has ever been. But what happens is, that we are handcuff ourselves to being open to new ways of teaching, new ways of learning, new pedagogy, because we are so rigid in our views. And I think this is to answer one of the questions about the university must, deal with its rigidity and its strict boundaries if it's going to extend beyond the disciplines and beyond the university corridors out into the community. That privilege and sort of the ivory tower, ivory walls that we talk about, builds that barrier, and we see no need to go outside of that barrier, because we have this comfort level within the university that we create. And it's a reality that prevents the interorganizational, the interdisciplinary work. To address the first question about Branford's ecological model, I mean, I was brought up on that in many respects. And so what I'm advocating for when we talk about coalition building is understanding the ecology of organizations and systems and how they interplay to have the impact upon the community. And the importance of, humanizing pedagogy, if we truly want to bring the child from cradle to career, is understanding what Bronfenbrenner's model essentially presents to us, which is understanding the ecology of experiences and contexts that contribute to the development of the child into the adult.
Thank you, Prof. We have 3 more questions to go. I'm going to give you the next 2 together from Denise Zinn. you mentioned that there are particular skill sets needed by cultural brokers. Are you suggesting that the philosophy of a humanizing pedagogy also needs to be advocated within these forums, for example, such as in the colloquium you mentioned, or were you making a different point? And the another second question there from Heloise, the concept of cultural broker alludes to some extent to someone that assists in meaning making. How can one relate this concept to change agents?
Well, the skill sets answer these things for cultural brokers, I see as being a part of the larger curriculum of humanizing pedagogy. Um, I think it's an essential skill set. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's not just a person, it's really a set of skills of helping us to be able to communicate between diverse organizations, diverse settings. You know, it gets back to if hubs of convergence, for example, is going to be successful, if LASEMA is going to be successful, we have to be able to communicate with each other and learn from each other. And we need to identify those persons that are able to do that, but also we need to identify the skills that are brought by the cultural brokers into the enterprise. And therefore, if we look at the large enterprises of humanizing pedagogy and learning and teaching, then the skills of cultural brokering must be a part of the, let me say, curriculum, all right? Something that can be taught, something that first and foremost needs to be understood as to how it plays a vital role, but also understanding, well, what are the set of skills that go into representing context, representing perspectives of others. And yes, cultural brokers are engaged in the process of meaning making. That's sort of implicit in some of the skill set. Yes, they help us to understand the meaning of things that facilitate communication between diverse groups, diverse people with different interests, who are trying to work together, trying to be together, trying to achieve a common goal.
Thanks, Prof. And our final question that we have in the last minute from Deidre, how do we make the language more community friendly?
That's a very simple question. You ask the community.
Okay.
And you engage the community. If you look at Just Research, one of the fundamental process that's represented in the book by Michelle Fine, Just Research, is how do you do research in the community? So how do you make the language easier? Is that you engage the very people that you want to communicate with and begin to represent what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And I'm positive you'll find, if you extend yourself and go look for persons there, they will reveal themselves to you. That's just been my experience in doing this kind of work. If you want to talk to youth, you go, you know, sit out in the pizza parlor, or what I used to do is go play basketball with them, and they suddenly, you know, emerge and help you to understand. The more simple example these days, being a grandfather, is I'm sitting there fumbling with my phone, and then finally my grandchildren just take the phone away from me and say, "What are you trying to do?" You know, and then they show me and hand the phone back, and then I'm frustrated, and I have to get into a learning and teaching experience. But you know, they are translating for me. I have now engaged them if I invite them to teach me. You know, so we have to invite you know, people to teach us. And that's how you begin to identify not only cultural brokers, but have a partnership with the very people that you want to work with. And that's what Just Research in terms of the PAR research is, one of the projects that she was involved with, when I'm talking about Michelle Fine, is working in the prison, And so she engaged the prisoners, much to the concern of the correction officers, in determining what kinds of questions should we be asking about your life and experience within the prison. But we didn't want to assume that we knew what those kinds of questions should be. And so that becomes extremely important to understand, that if we really need to talk to the very persons and engage the very persons we want to work with in the process of learning and teaching. So we need to engage students to help us and instruct us in a humanizing pedagogy. They can't be excluded in this process and just be vessels that we pour information in. There has to be some mutuality in the learning and teaching process.
Professor Anderson, J. Franklin, thank you so much for joining us today on behalf of the Humanizing Pedagogy Project and the LT CoLab and the Fact of Education. We thank you for a remarkable, wonderful, engaging webinar presentation today. We also thank Dr. Deidre Geduld for the insightful response. Dr. Geduld was really scared and she did not want to engage initially, but thank you so much, Dr. Geduld, for accepting and giving us such an insightful response. And to Dr. Bruce Darmans, thank you so much for the introduction as well. To all of the participants, I must say this has probably been the most engaging webinar in the series thus far. Thank you for all the questions and comments. I'm sorry if we couldn't get to them. And then I see many have requested a copy of the recording of this webinar. It will be uploaded onto the webinar webpage. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you to the participants. Thank you to those on Facebook as well for watching. And Prof, thank you again for accepting and for joining us today. Take care, everyone, and we'll meet in next week's webinar again. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.